Hi, and in this recording we'll be talking about your psychology and your opponent's psychology and how to manage your psychology and how you interact with your opponent's psychology. Now, one of the first things to do when you're going into any negotiation is to establish your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or you might call that a BATNA. So BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And really what I'm saying is here, you wouldn't go into any situation or negotiation without having some idea of what you wanted, what your options were, and most especially what your options are if the particular negotiation that you're going to go into fail. And it's really important that you've established this before you go into any kind of negotiation like that, because otherwise your alternatives may seem really constricted, artificially constricted. By artificial I mean may seem more artificial than they actually are in reality. A good example of this is made in chapter 6 of the book which accompanies this course, where the leader of Austria is facing up against Hitler. And the leader of Austria doesn't know what his options are, and the German regime really make it seem like his only option is to negotiate with Hitler and to establish terms. But even the terms, if you read through the beginning of chapter 6, you'll see even the terms were heavily manipulated. Now, that situation, I mean, that's of course an extreme situation, but it illustrates the point rather well. You shouldn't go into negotiations, particularly with an experienced negotiator, moral or immoral, without knowing what your alternatives are to a negotiated agreement. If you know what your alternatives are, you'll seem less desperate, and this will come across in your body language. Not having an alternative to a negotiated agreement is a really weak position and puts too much undue stress upon yourself. So really what I'm talking about here is being good to yourself. So go in there, know what it is you want, know what it is you don't want, know where you'll break off, know what your alternatives are. Really important, never go into any negotiation or any scenario not knowing what your best alternatives to a negotiated agreement are. And sometimes they'll be very few, but it's important that your opponent thinks that you do have alternatives to a negotiated agreement. Otherwise, you've increased his power or her power rather too much. Another thing here I'm going to talk about, and again, you won't find that in the book, and this is biochemical, and it relates as well to what happened. The happening alluded to in chapter 6 of the book with Hitler and the Austrian leader. The Austrian leader was a heavy smoker and he wasn't allowed to smoke around Hitler, and I guess we can understand that. But what isn't so well known, and it was recently published in a book called Blitzed, was that Hitler himself was very, very heavily medicated, was definitely on class A drugs. Again, it's not well known, but if you read through a recently published book called Blitzed, he had his own medical assistant with him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and he was being medicated heavily with class A drugs. And this is to say that you've got to look after yourself biochemically. So if you've got addictions, well, in any situation where you're under stress and you're negotiating, that's not going to be helpful. I mean, and sometimes addictions are things like caffeine. Don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting for a moment that everyone's on class A drugs, but it may be caffeine. It may be, in many people's cases, addiction to their mobile device. You've really got to deal with these and be a bit more disciplined. And if you really are addicted, then you've got to find ways of managing that during the negotiation. So if it's coffee that's your addiction, make sure you've got access to coffee. If sleep's one of your addictions, sleep is certainly one of my needs. I try to make sure that I've got enough if I'm going into really important negotiations. And I dare say that there are some people watching this recording thinking, are you nuts? Why are we talking about biochemical stuff? Why are we talking about drugs? Why are we talking about addictions? But another example I would give you is the establishment of the US dollar as the world currency and the IMF. There's a book by Ed Conway talking about how those negotiations happened. And you're talking about a week or two of leaders meeting from all over the world and drinking massive amounts of alcohol. And a lot of negotiating power came from the stamina in enduring these nights and a lot of long hours of copious drinking. So yeah, in summary, don't ignore that, because it happens in real life. Many really important negotiations of the last century were certainly at least alcohol influenced under the influence of alcohol and your ability to maintain it. So really what I'm saying is here, prepare, and that includes, if you're asthmatic, have your inhaler with you. Be prepared that you may have to turn your mobile off, and if there's key people in your friends and family who need you for key moments, just manage their expectations that you're actually going to have turned your phone off. And if that's a serious issue for you, and I know it is for a lot of people, perhaps you need to exercise more discipline in how often you use social media and whether you really need to. So establish discipline in yourself. If you're not that disciplined before the negotiation, make sure that you've got access to the things that you need. And if it's coffee, make sure you've got access to coffee. And always make sure that you know what your alternatives are to agreeing terms in that particular negotiation. Another key thing here is to do with body language. It's kind of related to biochemical in a way that, what the chemicals that are going through our body matter. The way that you hold yourself matters. How you feel is influenced a lot by how you hold your body. So, if I talk to you like this, I feel pretty good. If I start to talk to you like this, I start to feel really depressed. If I start to talk to you like this, I feel like a bit of a maniac. Maybe it kind of feels more like a kind of sporting or an aggressive body language if I'm opening up my chest a little bit too much. And the point here, if you're starting to feel constricted and bullied in negotiations or in a game of Risk, never go into yourself in your body language. It's safer for you to just expand yourself in a non-aggressive way, and you'll actually find that affects your psychology, and it massively affects how people will react to you. If they're trying to intimidate you and you're quite expansive in how you're presenting yourself and the space that you're taking up, they will start to feel like their attempts are not being successful. They may well be inside your mind, but you can manage your body language, and your body language should look confident and expansive when you're in those kinds of situations, and it will help your psychology. So never constrict when you're feeling threatened. Equally, sometimes you'll be sat down in a negotiation. Someone will come and sit at the desk you're sat at. So then you're in a situation where you're sat and you're looking up at them. Never put yourself in that kind of a situation. If someone ever comes and does that to you, simply stand up and talk to them. You'll find that you being so much lower down is not good for the negotiations, not good for how you feel about the negotiation. You standing up subliminally tells the person that is talking to you that you won't be intimidated. Another thing to watch out for is subtle body, well, not so subtle, but you'll see situations where you're across the table from somebody, you're both sat down, and they'll do something like this, which in body language terms means maybe one day you'll be as smart as me. It's subtly implying superiority, and I've been in this situation many times. You can't let that go because they'll keep on doing it for a very long time. And so the thing to do is not to aggressively point it out, but it's just to mirror them. Don't mirror them so much that it looks like you're imitating them. But if someone does this to you, leans back, simply do the same thing. It's a great way of just rejecting the transaction. And when they stop doing it, make sure you start doing it as well, because it is a little bit aggressive. But you'll certainly find a lot of people in senior management positions have been trained to do this sort of thing. And the way for you to negate that is just to imitate it, but not to imitate it in such a way that you're mimicking them. Another thing you can do to help manage this situation is having breaks and boundaries. Now, what do I mean by that? Things like, if you smoke like the leader of Austria did in the negotiations with Hitler, just negotiate that an hour, half an hour into it. You're going to have these breaks. You've got to take calls, or you'll have to check your phone. But agree these things up front. It's called setting the table, if you like. So establish those breaks and those boundaries. It's a great way of leveling the field. Also, you may have certain weaknesses that can be negated by breaks and boundaries. So, for example, if I present for many, many hours, as I have done, say like 4 or 5 hours all in one go, I don't then like to be in after dinner speech, after dinner conversation immediately after that. I need about 15-20 minutes where I'm absolutely on my own, perhaps in a hotel room, literally just on my own, just isolated. And previously, people around me didn't know that, and they just thought I could present for 4 or 5 hours and then immediately go straight into a social situation. Many can. I personally know myself well enough to know that I can't. And so I tell people I'll be unavailable for 15-20 minutes. Don't worry about it. I'll be down. I'll be fresh after that. That's the way I work. And you'll find people do respect that, but just manage their expectations. So build in breaks, build in boundaries. If you've got weaknesses, so mine, sometimes I need to be isolated. I do need sleep. I probably do need sleep not more than most people my age, but what do I mean by that? I'm particularly grumpy without sleep, more so than some of my peers. So one of the ways I manage that is to make sure that I do get enough sleep. If things go on for too long, making sure I can just get an hour, 2 hours, maybe a nap, and I'll be fine again. But it's all part of being good to yourself. And part of being good to yourself is knowing where your weaknesses are. We all have them. So in my case, as I say, I need to be on my own sometimes. I need to sleep sometimes. Other than that, basically I'm fine. But those are my weaknesses. So identify your own, find ways of managing them, and you can do that in your breaks by establishing boundaries during breaks. And no one needs to know what it is that you're doing, just that you're unavailable. Buffers. Now, oftentimes people will try and say things to you that perhaps aren't true and perhaps are a little bit provocative. They're trying to extract a reaction from you. And if you're tired, if you've been in long negotiations, this can be, it can force you into errors. One way to deal with this is simply to say, I'll think about that. I need to think about that. Or, I'll get back to you about that. In so doing, you're not agreeing, you're not disagreeing, but you're establishing a buffer of time when you'll get back to them about it, if indeed you ever do. And of course, no one can actually say to you that they object to you thinking about what they've just said. So do establish buffers like this, like I'll think about it. And of course, things like emails, for example, sometimes they're really inflammatory. Some people don't respond to emails that annoy them for 24 hours. So no matter what the buffer is, have a buffer that suits you, but do have buffers. Without buffers, you're going to get some dents in your bumpers. So it's a metaphor, of course, but the buffer's really helpful. So one I often use is, I'll think about that. Now, in the context of risk, it happens a lot in the game. Well, it happens in every game of risk, and it happens a lot in professional life as well. How do we deal with people who break alliances with us, or otherwise, I'm going to use a strong word, betrayal, but I'm using the word betrayal because everything's beginning with a B. So BATNA, biochemical, be good to yourself, body languages, breaks, boundaries, buffers. So how do you deal with betrayal or breaks of alliances? Well, first of all, let me deal with when would you break your alliances. So in scenarios where you've got to deal with those same people over and over again, I would say that you can never break the alliances that you make except with extremely just cause. So in situations where I was playing Risk over and over again, when I dealt with those people outside of Risk, that's not a situation where I would quite easily break alliances and break my word, because people have got to feel that they can trust you. We'll come back onto the word trust in just a moment, because trust is both about character and competence. But people need to know in terms of character that when you make agreement with them, more than all things being equal, that agreement stands, and that you'd only violate it under with just cause. So my advice in terms of building your brand, and I'll come back to brand in a moment, but my advice is that try not to break the allegiances and alliances and the contracts, the psychological contracts that you've made, because over the long term that will come back and bite. I have dealt with people who negotiate on one-off bases, who they are aggressive, they will break alliances, and in the short term they'll win. In the short term they'll win, definitely, but in the longer term they will always lose. So I would say don't break your word. People have to consider you as somebody who knows how to return a favour, and if somebody who makes alliances slowly and keeps them. So that's my advice in terms of betrayal, and that's my advice in terms of when you should break alliances. But to the main point I was about to make, if somebody makes an alliance with you in the game of Risk, what I would suggest is, if it's in a scenario where you're likely to lose that particular game, particularly if that's the result of the break of alliance, I would announce that you're going to do everything to wipe that person out. Now, you may be weaker now, but that's not the point. What you would have to do in that situation is tell the audience that you're now making a point of doing all the damage you can to that opponent who betrayed you. It will take you out of the game, but you'll have nothing to lose. And then go and do that. And the simple reason for that is that people have to... Trust is based on character and competence. Character in terms of not breaking your word, but competence is sometimes to do with establishing yourself as somebody who can't be messed around with. So if you've made an alliance and that alliance has been broken, it's an overt betrayal, and you're much weaker because of it and you'll probably lose the game, then I would certainly make an example of that person to the cost of everything else in the game, and do all the damage that you can. This will establish you later on in subsequent games as somebody who, not feared, you don't need to be feared, but as somebody who can't be messed with. And if you're somebody who can't be messed with, and you're somebody who breaks alliances only under extreme provocation and just cause, then you'll become somebody that can be trusted. And this takes me really back onto my my final point, which is about the brand. We have to establish a brand for ourselves, and if we don't establish a brand for ourselves consciously, a brand will be established for us. So I would suggest establish yourself as somebody who can be trusted both in terms of character and competence. Competence is to do, I would argue in this case, is to do with dealing with people who thwart you unfairly. So establish yourself as somebody who can't be messed with. Character is somebody who keeps his or her word. So establish yourself, have a brand, know what your brand is, and do it consciously. I would say establish yourself as somebody who can be trusted and shouldn't be messed with. That's my own advice to dealing with your own psychology and the psychology of your opponents in Risk, and in many cases in real life. One final thing I would add is to do with beliefs. One of my mentors gave me a belief long ago that all aggression stems from incompetence, and it's a really useful belief. I don't know whether it's accurate or not. Certainly some aggression does stem from incompetence, but I'm not judging this belief on whether it's accurate. I'm judging it by whether it's helpful, particularly in these kinds of stressful situations. So the belief, again, is that all aggression stems from incompetence. And what this means is that if you're in a situation where somebody starts to lose their temper, use threatening language, raise their voice, be too aggressive physically, then one of the first things I do is realise that the person I'm dealing with is demonstrating incompetence. Now, I don't know whether that's right or whether it's wrong, but it's really quite an empowering thing for me, because I can just sit there and learn, try and assess what their weakness is, what's caused them, what's triggered that weakness, and leaves me free to think about them rather than myself and not be intimidated. So it's a belief I have that's helped me in many stressful situations, that all aggression stems from incompetence. And again, I don't know that it's always true. I do know that it's often true, and I do know that it's a helpful belief that I've had that's helped me in many of these situations. So that's one that I recommend to you. That's the end of this video, and I hope you've enjoyed the course as much as I've enjoyed preparing it. Thank you.